Konnichiwa minasan and welcome to the class in the second lecture series on Introduction to Japanese Language and Culture. In our last class we did to you, which is another usage of to imasu. And what does it mean? It means is called. We also learnt a lot of other things, adverbs like yoku and taksan, and also did their comparison as to how they are different and where they are going to be used. So, with this we also did some polite verbs. Now, you will see that you all watch a lot of animation, and in animation they use a lot of informal Japanese, that is verb in plain form. You have done polite verbs now. So, you will see that it is always better to learn verbs in mass form and use verbs in polite form, and that will help you in construction of sentences, in speaking to people who are senior to you, and in formal situations. So, as an exercise, now what you should do is, whenever you are watching animation and wherever you see that informal Japanese is used, try to use polite verbs and mass form. So, now as we always do, we are going to listen to a small kaiwa where I have something new for you today, and after you have heard the kaiwa, I will do all the explanation of the grammar. So, let us hear the kaiwa now.
Rao-san, ronbun happyou wa nanji kara desu ka?
先生はさっき午前中とおっしゃったけど、まだよくわからない。
もう時間ないから先生に聞いた方がいいと思いますよ。
そうします。皆さん、明日発表に来てくださいませんか？
行きたいけれども、明日午前中は仕事があるので、後で行きます。研究室から先生方もいらっしゃいますか？
はい、研究室から小林先生と山田先生が来ると思います。
じゃあ、頑張らなくちゃね。
So, you just heard the kaiwa, and I am sure you could understand most of it, but there is some grammar that we are going to do today. So, I will read it once to you. Kaiwa wa Mira-san to Rao-san no aida desu. Futari wa ima ronbun happyou no koto ni tsuite hanashite imasu. Ronbun happyou wa nanji kara desu ka? Ronbun is your thesis, happyou is presentation. So, ronbun happyou wa nanji kara desu ka? Sensei wa sakki gozen chū to oshatta kedo, mada yoku wakaranai. So, sensei wa saki. Saki is just a little while back. Gozen chū, that is in the morning. To imashita, he said. But, mada, not yet. Wakaranai, I am not very sure. Here is very. Yoku wakaranai, I am not very sure. Mou jikan nai kara. You can see very clearly that you don't have any time. Already there is very little time. Sensei ni kiita hoga ii to omou yo. So, nai kara. Kara is reason, and if it is informal, then plain form of the verb is all right. Over here they are friends probably, or maybe studying at the same place, maybe in the same kenkyu shitsu, and they just use plain form. Mou jikan nai kara. Mou jikan arimasen kara would be more polite. Sensei ni kiita hoga ii to omoimasu. You have done kiita hoga in your last series. Hoga is, it is better that, and before hoga we have plain form. I have explained it later also. So, just understand this. Sensei ni kiita hoga ii, it is better that you ask sensei to omoimasu, I think. And over here yo shows very clearly that these two are friends of the same age. So, they can talk informally. You will never use yo with your seniors. So shimasu, I will do as you are saying. Mira-san, ashita happyou ni kite kudasaimasen ka? Now, they are friends, but just to show you, I have used kudasai masen ka. Though he could have said kite kuremasen ka or kimasen ka informally. Ikitai keredemo, ashita gozen chū wa shigoto ga aru node atode ikimasu. Ikitai, you have done this form earlier. I want to go. Keredemo is polite for kedo. Please remember kedo. Ashita gozen chū wa shigoto ga aru node. Because I have shigoto, atode ikimasu. So, node is again polite for kara. Now, there is a difference over here in kara and node. Maybe I will take that up sometime later, not now. You can just understand it as node is a grade up than kara. Both mean reason or because. Ato is later. Kenkyu shitsu kara sensei gata mo irashaimasu ka? Kara is from over here. From Kenkyu shitsu sensei gata or kata as you did in the beginning. Ishida-san to you kata. Mo irashaimasu ka? Irashaimasu is polite for iku, kuru and iru. Iku is go, kuru is come and iru is to be. Imasu. So, for all three, irashaimasu is polite. Now, hai, kenkyu shitsu kara, from again, Kobayashi sensei to and Yamada sensei ga kuru to omoimasu. This is exactly what we are going to do today, and gambara nakcha means yes, you have to work very hard. Now, this is all in your script. I want to show this to you. You know the kanji for sensei, sensei. Now, you can see the same sen over here. What does it mean? This sen is the same as this. It means earlier, and the reading is Saki. So, someone who is born before you is your teacher, and you can learn from him. Gozenchu is another kanji which you can remember. Then jikan. Then you have ashita, iku, Kobayashi sensei, Yamada sensei, omoimasu. This I am going to do very soon. So, today in our kaiwa we have some polite verbs and some polite expressions. You have done some earlier. Now, let us see these new verbs and see how we can use these verbs in our conversation and improve our spoken skills. So, what are these verbs now? This verb you have done you, which means to say. What is the polite for you? Polite for you is osharu, as is given. Osharu. 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 Oshaimasu, to say. So, when you are talking about teachers, when you are talking about very senior people, then to imasu is not preferred, oshaimasu. He said that or he was telling that is better and sounds more respectful. Then you have also done this verb mosu. Mosu also means to be called. So, where have you used this verb? Can you remember and tell me please? Okay. It is polite for imasu. So, watashi wa Tanaka to moshimasu. I am called Tanaka. It is the same as watashi wa Tanaka to imasu or watashi wa Tanaka desu. Polite is Tanaka to moshimasu. Moshi ageru. Moshi remove the mas, make it a noun, and noun verb over here, moshi agaru. What does that mean? To speak or to tell again. I will speak and tell you is what it means. Now, look at this example. Kokoro kara ore o moshi agemasu. So, kokoro is your heart, from the bottom of my heart. Ore is gratitude. O moshi agemasu. I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I am saying that. Now, as I told you just now, mosu, where are you going to use? Hajimemashite, watashi wa Rao desu is what you have done. Rao desu. So, Rao to moshimasu. I am called Rao, or my name is Rao. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Now, the kanji for mosu is very, very simple. Do this, make nichi and just cut it. Is that okay? Simple, make nichi and cut it. So, this is mosu. I am giving you very simple kanjis so that you can learn them, and from there you can start learning some difficult characters as well. There was a very simple kanji here, which is kokoro. This is kokoro, this means heart. Kokoro kara moshi agemasu. Ageru is ue. This is the kanji for ue, and ageru is also another reading for the same character. Now, hontou no koto o yutte kudasai. Please say what is the truth, the real thing. Please tell me. Please say it. Hontou no koto o oshatte kudasai. Please tell me, very, very polite. Somebody senior you are talking to, so oshatte kudasai. To a friend, itte kudasai. Then hontou no koto o oshatte itadakemasen ka? So, whatever you really feel, whatever the real thing is, or you think about a certain thing, please oshatte, polite, itadakemasen ka? You please say and I will receive the favor. This is very, very polite in Japanese. Hontou no koto o oshatte itadakemasen ka? So, you place yourself somewhere here and somebody is going to tell you something and you will receive the favor. That is how degrees you can see. There are many, many more, but for the time being, from the Japanese that we have done, we can figure out at least these 3. Now, there is a small kaiwa and you will see how politely you invite someone to do a certain thing. This is not a literal translation over here. This is what you would say in English here. So, ashita hima desu ka? Are you free? Do you have time? Hai, yasumi desu. It's a holiday. Ja issho ni eiga o mimasen ka? Won't you please see a film together with me tomorrow? So, basically inviting someone, verb in negative and ka makes it a polite invitation. Donna eiga? Which eiga are you talking about? Ano. Ano is when they do know a little about what the person is talking, both the listener and the speaker. They are aware that something like this is there. Ano Disney no yume na eiga yo? Says, don't you know that famous Disney movie? Ah, Pinocchio desu ka? Ja, ikimashou. Ah, you are talking about Pinocchio. Oh, really? Ah, I understand. So, you mean Pinocchio. Ja, ikimashou. Let's go. So, basically inviting people, verb in negative form plus ka makes it an invitation. Now, this verb iku you know, to go, and kuru is to come. So, what is the polite for these two? The polite is irasharu or irashai mas. To be, which is iru, to go, which is iku, and to come, which is kuru, as is given over here. Now, mairimasu is I will go and come to the same point. I will go out for a while and come. Iku means just go, but mairimasu is like this, go and come, mairu. So, look at this. This is a picture you have seen a number of times, I am sure. Somebody is leaving house. So, the person who is leaving the house, that is Tanaka-san, what does he say? Itte kimasu. Normal expression, itte kimasu to his wife, to his kids, and the lady says itte irashai. That is the phrase. And in olden times, the ladies would actually sit down on the floor over here, bow their head and then say itte irashai, which is very, very polite, because he is the one who is earning, he is the one who is the master of the house, providing the food. So, he is the Danna-sama and to be respected by all. Thus, you go down on your knees and bow over here and say itte irashai for respect when someone is going. So, this person says itte irashai, this person says itte kimasu. In a formal situation where maybe it is not your family and maybe you are leaving your house, you meet some people downstairs in your building, and then what would you say? So, this expression itte kimasu changes to itte mairimasu in a formal situation where you do not know the person, but still you have to nod and you have to reply. Like in English we would say, how are you, or good morning. So, in a similar manner, if you are leaving your building, you could say itte mairimasu, I will go and come, which is very, very polite. Now, something very interesting over here, you will look at these verbs irasharu, we did osharu, and then we have also done kudasaru, kudasai masen ka. So, now all these verbs end in ru over here, but what is the mas form? Kudasaimasu is there and not kudasari mas, which should have been there for all group 1 verbs, isn't it? They are all group 1, all ending in ru. We just need to remove the u from here and put rimas, kudasari mas, but this is incorrect. The correct one is kudasai mas. We remove all the ru's from here and put imas, as these are all irregular special verbs. Please remember this. This is just for information, not something that you really need to worry about. Now, you have seen this picture as well. This is when you are introducing yourself. So, hajimemashite, watashi wa Rao to moshimasu. Moshimasu over here, which you did in your previous slide, and Indo kara mairimashita, meaning kimashita, polite. So, I have come from India over here, which is polite. So, this is your actual polite introduction, first time introduction to anyone. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. I hope you have understood. Now, the conjunction kedo is a joining word and joins 2 sentences showing contrast. Today, we will see the formal part or the polite word for kedo. So, you can see over here. Now, the example is isogashi kedo ikimasu. So, we just did the kanji for isogashi also. Now, the formal or polite word for kedo is keredomo. Kedo and keredomo both mean but, although, though, as they are conjunctions. They are similar in meaning to demo or ga, which you have done. You can see the informal forms of keredomo from least to most formal. So, now what is the grammar over here? Though you can change kedo and keredomo, but kedo is to be used with friends and keredomo is to be used with seniors. These of course are used, but you can very well see that this is the most polite and the least polite. Now, the important part here is that before kedo, the verb, adjective and na adjectives and nouns are going to be used in plain form. What do I mean by that? Well, either in dictionary form or in past plain form, in I adjective as well, katta, which is past form, benri, datta for na adjectives and nouns. How are we going to use it? You can see over here, watashi wa gakko ni itta kedo, though I went, or keredomo if you are talking to someone you do not know, daremo imasen deshita, nobody was there. Gakko ni itta kedo, even though I went, daremo imasen deshita. So over here you can use keredomo as well. Verb is in past plain form. You can also make it polite if you want to use it with keredemo, and also with kedo. All you need to do is to put verb in mas form, and that will make the sentence polite even with kedo. Now, kono jisho wa takai kedo, takai keredomo totemo benri desu. Now, this word totemo is showing degree, and it can be used in a lot of ways, but the usage that you have done till now is for adjectives. So, showing degree of adjective is totemo, to be used before the adjective. Kono jisho wa takai kedo totemo benri desu. It's exceptionally or very benri. There is more practice for you today. Michi wa nagai kedo benri desu. Again you can see nagai kedo benri desu. It's long but convenient. Rao-san wa 90 sai kedo mainichi 5 kilo gurai arukimasu. Approximately, but, so 90 sai kedo mainichi every day 5 kilo gurai arukimasu. He walks. Even though he is 90 years old, every day he walks for approximately 5 kilometers. Kono densha wa benri kedo jikan kakarimasu. Kakarimasu we have done earlier is for time taken. So, kono densha wa benri kedo. Even though it is benri, it takes a lot of time. So, it has a slightly negative meaning as well. If you want to make it polite, you can say benri desu kedo. Now, there was a phrase ta hoga. When you want to suggest something very strongly to a person, then you would use ta hoga. So, what is the important thing that you have to keep in mind before hoga? We have to keep in mind is before hoga also you will have to use plain form of the verb. So, verb in dictionary form is a mild suggestion, meaning slightly suggesting something, and verb in past form, which is what we are going to do over here today, is a very, very strong suggestion, something that you are suggesting very or saying very emphatically to the person, and you want him to do it. So, what is it? The grammar is before hoga you will have to use plain form of the verb as is given over here: hanasu, hanashita, hanasanai, takai and takakatta, and for noun no is going to be used. Now, how is it going to be done? This is dictionary form, this is the past plain form, this is the present negative, takai and then takakatta, past form. I have only given these to you at the moment because These are easy to understand and we will do the rest in some other lesson. Yonda and yomanai hoga ii. Now let us see the sentences that are there. Gakusei wa benkyou shita hoga ii. So as a student, what are you supposed to do? You are supposed to do benkyou, to study. So shita hoga ii is a strong suggestion. If you say gakusei wa benkyou suru hoga ii, so it is like, okay, you are being very soft. Kodomo wa yasai mo tabeta hoga ii yo. So your mother is saying, or the doctor is telling you, kodomo wa yasai mo tabeta hoga ii yo. It is better that children have vegetables as well. You can also use it for not to do something. Asobanai hoga ii. And I am sure this you have heard a lot from your mother. It is better that you do not play this much. So this is not a literal translation, but this is what your mother would say. Asobanai hoga ii. Itsumo asobanai hoga ii. So always. Tokidoki benkyou shita hoga ii. So I am sure all of you have heard this from your parents a lot, from your teachers a lot. Takusan kocha o nomanai hoga ii. Well, everybody says that kocha and kohi. Kocha to kohi wa takusan nomanai hoga ii. So when you are not supposed to do something, this has to be in negative. And tabeta hoga ii is it is better that you do it. Everybody wants a big house. So if you are staying in a small house and lot of people are there, so oki uchi no hoga ii. So it's your desire. So you can see after noun, no is to be used. Tanaka sensei no hoga ii. You want Tanaka-san to teach you or you want someone else to teach you. So you say Tanaka-san no hoga ii or Tanaka sensei no hoga ii. Now we have kara also over here. Kara is to show reason for doing or not doing a certain activity. So kitanai kara, because it is dirty, soji shita hoga ii desu. It is better that you do soji. Or you can also say kitanai kara soji shite kudasai. So it is a polite request that kitanai kara soji shite kudasai. This is very, very strong. It is better that you do it. Now, okyaku-san ga kuru kara. So if your house is dirty, what are you supposed to do? You are supposed to clean it. So somebody is suggesting okyaku-san ga kuru kara soji shita hoga ii desu. Okyaku-san ga kuru kara soji shite kudasai. So this is how you can change and see the exact meaning of these phrases. Ashita shiken ga aru node, ima benkyou shita hoga ii desu. It is better to study now as you have a test tomorrow. Then look at this picture and see what is he doing. He is asking. So, wakaranai toki, when you do not know or do not understand. Sensei ni kiita hoga ii. It is better that you ask sensei or sensei ni kiite kudasai. Please ask sensei. Now, shiranai toki, michi o kiite kudasai. There is a small mistake over here, the double I, kiite kudasai. Kiita hoga ii desu. It is better that you ask. Or shiranai toki, michi o kikanakereba narimasen. We have done this also in lesson 17. Please revise this, that it is a must to ask. Even though it is in negative, the meaning is positive. Mainichi gakko e ikanakereba narimasen. I have to go to school every day. Now, in our kaiwa we also had to omoimasu, which is equivalent to think in English. How is that used? You can see over here Tanaka-san thinking about beer. So, planning to have beer, to think, and the verb is omou, omou, and the kanji is very simple. This is field and this is kokoro you did just now. So, when you join the two, it is this, omou. Now, you already know that particle to is also used as a quotation marker, which we did in lesson 17 and 18. Today, we will use the same particle to with omou and see what it means and how it is used with nouns, adjectives and verbs. You can look over here. Mira wa ashita gakko e what? Gakko e iku. She will go tomorrow. Gakko e ikanai. She will not go tomorrow. Mira wa kino gakko e itta. She went to school
yesterday.
Kino gakko e ikanakatta. She did not go to school
yesterday.
So, these two, as they are in past, the expression over here, time expression, will also be in past. Now, what do you see from here? The important thing is that with to omou also, as with kedo and with hoga, we use plain form of the verb and it means I think. If you have to ask a question, put a ka over here and then you can ask somebody, what do you think about a certain matter? Mira-san wa ashita gakko e ikimasu ka? Okay, so now what you can see from here is that with omoimasu you will use plain form and you can also change this time expression to kino, ototoi, raigetsu, raishu, rainen, and as I just now told you, with past tense kino and ototoi will be used, or sengetsu, senshu, as they are past time expressions. So, keep the expression in mind and then use the verb over here in plain form. You can see it now. Tanaka-san wa rainen, next year, Tokyo e iku to omoimasu. Thus, we have iku. I think Tanaka-san is going to Tokyo next year. Then, ashita gakko e ikanai to omoimasu. Again, you can see it's about tomorrow. So, ikanai to omoimasu. I don't think I will go to school tomorrow. Then, Tanaka-san wa hitori de itta to omoimasu. I think he went alone. Now, this is a very simple kanji, ichi and hito, which has a special reading, hitori. You can see and remember this, it is not ichi hito, it is hitori, and hitori is a special reading. Particle de is used to show number. So, hitori de, alone. And ikanakatta, past tense, Tanaka-san wa hitori de ikanakatta to omoimasu. So, all along you will see that to omoimasu is not changing, this part is changing. So, this part will change and to omoimasu will remain as is. Now, there is more practice. Tanaka-san wa hitori de Mexico ni ikanakatta to omoimasu. He did not go to Mexico alone. Now, anata wa ashita kaigi ni ikimasu ka? Watashi wa ashita kaigi ni ikanai to omoimasu. As you do not know whether you are going to do something tomorrow or not, thus ikanai to omoimasu. Higher probability is that you will not go because verb is in negative. If the verb is in positive, for example, iku to omoimasu, then higher probability is that you will go. Now, kaigi ni nan nin kimasu ka? 3 nin ga kuru to omoimasu. So, there is a very high probability of 3 people coming. I am quite positive. Now, 毎日散歩した方が体にいいと思います。I think it's a very good thing to walk every day for the body. Karada is body and karada is a simple kanji. You know this is ki, which is tree. This is hon, which you have seen in Nihon. Now, all you need to do is put this over here. This makes it karada. You will remember this kanji now. Karada. Now, let's see what else we have. There is more practice. 毎日シャワーを浴びた方がいいと思います。It is a good idea to have a shower every day or take a shower every day. Now, how do we know that father is talking? You will see, ミラ、母さん心配するから毎週電話した方がいいと思います。Because he is using 母さん or maybe お兄さん is using or お姉さん is using. So, some family member is speaking because 母さん is used. If it was someone else, then お母さん would have been used. 心配するから she will worry. So, every week 電話した方が電話 phone した方が it is better that you call her every day, I think. There is lots of practice for you today so that you can understand と思います very easily. So, わからないとき先生に聞きます a statement that I ask sensei when I do not understand. わからないとき先生に聞いてください somebody is suggesting. Then わからないとき先生に聞いた方がいいです So, it's a very strong suggestion. Now, look at this one. わからないとき先生に聞いた方がいいと思います I think it is better that you ask sensei. So, all 4 are there. You can go over it again. Try to make another sequence like this with some other picture and see the difference on your own. So, now when omoimasu is used with so and words like do, which means what, do desu ka or so as you are saying, then to is not used with omoimasu. You have this example in your kaiwa also. Look up the example. Now, you can see この映画はどう思いますか? この映画はどうですか? How is the 映画? この映画はどう思いますか? What do you think about the 映画? So, he says something 面白いです or 面白くないです Ah, そうですか So, oh, is that so? Is that so? Or so shimasu as is given in your kaiwa. So, shimasu means I will do as you are saying. So, shimasu do as said or suggested. Think up of a situation and do the same kaiwa and I am sure you will understand. Now, there are some kanjis for you. These are simple kanjis. You have done them earlier. This is ashita like this and nichi. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. One kanji is this and one kanji is this, meaning ashita. Now, yasumi. So, we just did karada, which was like this. Though the construction is different, first you put this stroke, this stroke, this stroke and then this stroke for karada. Now, for yasumi, it's simple. This is hito and this is tree. So, if I make it like this, tree over here, I put this hito sitting and he is sitting over here and probably relaxing or doing something. So, person and Yasumi is this character. Then what do we have? This is Yasumi. Isogashi. Isogashi is Isogashi. E is important over here. It's an I adjective. A simple character. I am giving all simple characters to you. Isogashi and E. She and E. Isogashi. Busy. Then we have Yume. So, Yume is famous. Now, this character, this also means aru, arimasu, to be, and word with arimasu is yume, 1, 2, ski and then ta and kuchi, yume. Now, you will see some other words with same kanjis, you can learn these as well. This is akari, which is illumination, which is lot of light, brightness. Then akarui is well lit, same character, akarui. Then asatte. So, you can see over here, and this also is ato, day after tomorrow is asatte. Then we have aru, I just told you aru, and arigatai, same character, ari and gatai. Arigatai is thankful for something. These are some characters. You have already done the words, you do not have to worry, you just need to see the characters again and again, and I am sure you will be able to read next time you see it, even if you are unable to make it. So, the first thing about kanji is you should know the word, then you should be able to recognize the character, get to understand the meanings, the different words, and then go on to writing. So, well, with this I would like to end today's class. There were lot of things here that you learned. You did hoga, you did to omoimasu, then we did a lot of kanji characters, we did some polite forms as well. So, well, practice all this at home with your partner, with your friends, and look up the net, see how you can make some kaiwa, some conversation, and I am sure that is going to help you in speech as well. So, with this, mata aimashou. Arigatou gozaimasu.